it certainly sounds like the U.S. would love to maintain the geopolitical power to economically sanction. I think a realist would look at some of these things and ask themselves, how long can that power actually be preserved in the face of alternatives? And I even think the most strident, like folks around that are true believers in economic sanctioning would probably admit that it's an exhaustible resource, right? So like just the game theory of it is such that other countries would try to route around if they could. I guess this sort of brings us to stablecoins. So one difference between the euro dollar and stablecoins is in the euro dollar apparatus, because the origination and the setup was basically U.S. banks. The U.S. still was able, through the export of its dollar, to preserve the might of its sanctioning facility. In fact, almost enhance that ability.
Yeah.
With stablecoins, it might not be so clear cut, and I want to dig into that the crux of this issue. So, is there evidence today that foreign actors are using stablecoins for any sort of sanctions evasion? We've seen news headlines of this. There was talk of Hamas maybe using this. Some of this was like based on spurious evidence, and it came out that Hamas was actually not using stablecoins and crypto at scale. It doesn't mean that some foreign adversary couldn't in the future, though. So take us to the state of stablecoins in this conversation around economic sanctionability.
Well, I think people are using them to escape sanctions. What's hard is to quantify by how much. In the case of Hamas, I've talked to people at Chainalysis and TRM and other places. And initially there was a report that said this was, pretty significant. Then people realized there was some problems with the analysis. They were sort of counting the total held in certain accounts at intermediaries rather than just the part that was going to Hamas or something. So those estimates were scaled back. But I think the conclusion is generally that Hamas is using crypto and stablecoins to some extent. Similarly, there were reports that there were Russians that were using Tether to buy arms and evade sanctions. So I think it is happening. It's, again, hard to quantify it. But the reason is that stablecoins, as we know, settle on decentralized blockchains. And therefore, transactions don't have to pass through a bank. Now, if you want to convert that stablecoin back into fiat currency, back into dollars, you either have to do that on a trading platform like Coinbase or Kraken, or you've got to figure out a bank that will do it for you or whatever. So that off-ramp conversion is a point at which you could say, well, we should be able to catch the perpetrator then, right? And we should. But the point is that as stablecoins grow and as the crypto universe grows, you have the risk that people can transact without doing that conversion, without going through an off-ramp, as apparently the Russian smugglers were able to do, or, they're going through off-ramps that aren't abiding by those sanctions. You can have offshore entities that aren't abiding. There are international rules. Something called the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, has issued guidance, on how virtual asset service providers and exchanges and so forth have to apply certain laws to prevent illicit activity, to prevent money laundering. But not all jurisdictions are enforcing those. So the risk is that you can have activity that doesn't go through an off-ramp, particularly as the crypto universe grows, or goes through an off-ramp that isn't following those rules, and therefore can circumvent sanctions. And that's kind of the thing I talk about in the paper, and the need, therefore, to look at this. And, I view it, again, it's not a reason to say, oh, stablecoins are bad. Let's hope that they don't grow, because I don't think that's a good policy. But rather, it's a reason to say we need to create a regulatory framework around this and to look at how we do prevent illicit activity. with these.
Okay. And so do you think that this issue is kind of alive and well, and maybe one of the primary issues that any U.S. legislation would have to face and surmount, and like the U.S. government would have to get comfortable with in order to start promoting stablecoins? You think this is the big one, the ability to kind of like sanction, preserve that?
Well, I think it's pretty big. I think it's pretty big. And I think we've seen a lot of people in Congress pay attention to this, whether it's, I mean, I talk about this in the paper. I mean, Senators Elizabeth Warren, who I also had the privilege of working for briefly, and Roger Sherman introduced, a bill that would impose anti-money laundering responsibilities and Bank Secrecy Act responsibilities on crypto generally. And I think they're very concerned about stablecoins from this aspect. I think a lot of people are concerned about this. So I think the issue is what I've said when I've talked to people who work for Congress people is, look, I don't expect Congress to figure out exactly how we will do this, because the technology is going to evolve, the technology is going to change. But what we need to do is create a regulatory framework where there is an authority, whether that's the Federal Reserve or somebody else, with authority to figure out what those requirements should be, what those rules should be. And, Congress can give some general direction. And I talk about some of the ways we might do this. I mean, obviously, the holy grail of, in some ways, might be some sort of digital identity system, right, where a stablecoin smart contract won't process a transaction unless your identity has been vetted by some authorized vetter and you've pinged your, enough information about that so that the, transaction goes through. I mean, that's one solution. There are others that people are talking about. So I do think we need to talk about this. Look, I mean, to step back from this, I would say the following generally about crypto. We're bogged down in this debate about whether something is a security or a commodity. And I've argued why we shouldn't be bogged down in that, and there's a way to get around that. To me, that's not the big issue. The big issue is the rails. The big issue is, when we talk about tokenization and we talk about digital assets, are we going to get comfortable with digital assets, with tokenized assets traveling on decentralized blockchains or not? They pose enormous advantages in terms of innovation, composability, open access, right? We've seen that. I mean, that is, clearly one of the incredible things about this space. One of the things that keeps me interested is just the amount of innovation and creativity that is taking place. I spent a lot of time on, a college campus, and I meet a lot of students who are quite interested in this space because of that. And I admire that. But on the other hand, decentralized blockchains may not offer the kind of governance that we'd like, the kind of ability to check identity, and our financial system does turn on the ability to know who is transacting. So how do we balance that? That, to me, is the central issue in digital assets.
I'd really like to dig into this a little bit more, just because there's just a fundamental trade-off space between, traditional bank transfers of dollars versus stablecoin transfers on the rails. And of course, there are some properties about payment rails on Ethereum, on crypto, that are just brand new, and people still just need to wrap their heads around. Like, if some illicit actor gets their hands on stablecoins, there's no one to really talk to reverse a transaction. There's no reversible transactions. Right. It's actually not easy. It's not trivial to just immediately identify an actor. Yet nonetheless, at the same time, there's so much data out there because of the fact that it's a public permissionless ecosystem. Right. And so while there's no central authority, which makes people uncomfortable, the amount of data that's out there is highly available. So there is a trade-off space that's not completely neutering the power of regulators to really elicit the control that they want to control. It's just now it comes in a different flavor. There's different strategies. So just how do you feel about just the different trade-off space, about the tools that regulators have because of the affordances of crypto versus what they're familiar with?
Well, I think that's right. Well, to maybe zero in specifically on this question of illicit activity, obviously the data, if this is what you're getting at, the transparency of the blockchain in terms of being able to see every transaction is always there, is an enormous benefit when you're trying to track illicit use. Of course, it's pseudonymous, so you have to be able to somehow figure out the identity of a person. But that is a big asset in law enforcement. And law enforcement people will say that. On the other hand, of course, you can transfer things very, very quickly. So, you could, one of the things I talk about in the paper is, should we be requiring stablecoin issuers? Stablecoin issuers presumably can apply anti-money laundering and KYC and combating financial terrorism, what we call CFT requirements, when they issue or redeem a stablecoin. And, if you talk to Jeremy Allaire or people at Circle or wherever, they will say they're doing that. And I believe that, they are. But obviously, once the stablecoin is issued, it can be transferred to anyone. And so the question is, what responsibility do they have then? One of the things I talk about in the paper is whether stablecoin issuers should be responsible for not simply kind of monitoring transactions, but kind of aggressively monitoring and maybe doing risk analysis of wallets, and maybe even taking action to seize and freeze coins. Now, they will, I think Circle would say, well, if law enforcement comes to us and says, gives us a subpoena, or obviously they'd do it then, or maybe if they give us enough evidence, we'll do it. But we can't just freeze anyone's coins on the basis of our own due diligence. So we're going to have to think about that. We're going to have to think about, how do we balance reasonable expectations of privacy, and we don't want improper seizures going on. But on the other hand, we're going to need stablecoin issuers, I think, to actively monitor what's going on the chain. And, Circle's on 12 or 16 blockchains now.
This balancing, Tim, is such an interesting conversation. I think this is the meat of the conversation. I just want to, at this point of the conversation, just thank you for engaging us in this way. You're coming on a crypto podcast. You can imagine we're not super favorable towards the Senator Warren bill to kind of extend the Bank Secrecy Act and effectively KYC, validators and mining equipment, all of these things. We think that there's a better way, but I appreciate that you're coming here and we're all collectively addressing what I called in the intro, the elephant in the room, because I think it's an elephant in the room. And I actually want to press into that more, because it's not just stablecoins. With stablecoins, there's the ability to freeze, as we mentioned. There's lots of different abilities that a Circle might have to kind of control these things. Once it's on chain, less so, but there's still some capabilities here. With crypto native assets and decentralized networks like Bitcoin that we were talking about earlier, that is a commodity, right? And Ethereum, Ether, the asset, transitioning, moving that from place to place, that's not issued by a Circle. It is not the US government kind of behind this. And so let's just full on address the elephant in the room here, okay? In propagating decentralized networks, the fact that we have an open internet and open blockchain networks means that there is the ability for illicit activity to happen on a chain like Ethereum with a crypto native asset. Maybe not with a stable coin, but certainly with a crypto native asset. And I think the question that the crypto industry is sort of asking those in the US government is what do we do about this? Are you effectively going to AML KYC everything? Is there some notion of an open internet that we can preserve, an open chain that we can preserve? And I'll just run this one kind of game theoretical outcome that could be the case, right? So let's imagine we start living in more of a multipolar world where the US has less ability to economically sanction, less of the world runs on SWIFT. Well, it then seems to be the case that you could have a world that runs in kind of like the US block financial system, Swift based, and then you might get some alternatives. You might get, China or something like this. What's interesting about blockchain is it doesn't have an alliance with either. It's credibly neutral. And so one question, I don't know that this is being considered, but I would wonder if it's considered, is if the US has to pick between the world kind of moving to a Chinese central bank digital currency type of system and a China-led SWIFT, or something that is credibly neutral, like blockchain, like Ethereum, which would it pick? And I know it seems like very preemptive for us to start having this conversation considering the size of crypto to date, but it's still like a possible outcome. Yeah, what do you say to that hodgepodge of thought?
I guess what I would say to that is we clearly don't want a Chinese CBDC model or a Chinese dominated SWIFT. But look, I guess I'd approach it all maybe slightly differently. The fact that blockchain, distributed ledger technology is sort of like the internet in the sense that it's supranational is, a big thing, a big potential benefit, but also potential risk, if you will. But the truth is, we still live in a world of nation states, and laws are made by nation states. And I believe in that. And, I'd love to see harmonization of certain areas of the law. I did that. I worked on that a lot when I was at the CFTC with derivatives, believe me. But, the fact is we still live in a world of nation states. We have countries that obviously don't share our values of democracy and openness, and I don't want to become like them. And I want us to, make sure that we continue to uphold our values. And I don't believe that, blockchain technology is of such great advantage that I would sacrifice anything in terms of those, values of this country and what it stands for, and the rule of law, and the strength of our financial system, which is in part built on transparency, just because of the potential advantages that blockchain technology might offer. And I think you have to recognize, I think the crypto industry needs to recognize that that is how financial regulators think, in part, right? And meaning that, yeah, the crypto sector is small, and while crypto advocates may see huge amounts of potential given the open access, given the innovative potential, given the composability, the U.S. government is not going to, give away or it's not going to diminish the values that I think are at the heart of this country and have contributed to its strength simply to promote that innovation. We've got to find a way to promote innovation with this technology that is consistent with our values. And that means, people in government need to understand the technology better. Some of them do, some of them don't. And it means people in crypto need to understand the purposes of financial regulation and the value of financial regulation better. People in crypto can't just say no. They can't just say, well, it's decentralized or it's supranational, so, U.S. laws shouldn't matter. They shouldn't say that. That's not going to get us anywhere. We've got to have responsible, reasonable people from all sides kind of get together and think about how do we create a framework where this technology can develop and can develop in useful, constructive ways that are consistent with our values. That's what I'm interested in, at least.
To continue leveling up your crypto game, then you need to get on the Bankless newsletter. It's the world's most popular crypto email and is completely free. Just click below to sign up.